Stage 4. Pancreatic.
The morning Vivienne Hartley found out her husband was dying, she was arranging peonies in the kitchen of the house her father had built with his own hands 40 years earlier. Grayson stood in the doorway, holding a manila folder like it weighed more than he could carry. Stage 4, he said. Pancreatic. The flowers slipped from her fingers and scattered across the tile. She would think about that folder for months afterward. How clean it looked. How official. How she never once asked to see the actual scan. If you're new here, welcome to Earned Love. And if you've been with us before, you already know what's coming. A family, a fortune, and a truth that takes far too long to surface. Stay to the end, because the woman who ends up breaking this case wide open is not who you'd expect. Subscribe now, because this story only gets harder to look away from. Vivienne was 61, a retired school teacher who had spent the last decade running Hartley & Vale, the furniture restoration business her father had founded and she had inherited outright. No siblings to split it with, no complicated family tree to fight over. When she'd sold the business 3 years earlier to a regional antiques company, the sale had set her up for the rest of her life. $2,300,000, carefully invested, meant to carry her and Grayson through a quiet retirement of morning walks and grandchildren who hadn't arrived yet. She never imagined the money would disappear in 18 months, spent chasing a disease that didn't exist. She had grown up in that house, in that kitchen, watching her father, Elias Hartley, hunch over a workbench in the garage every evening, coaxing warped wood and cracked veneer back into something worth keeping. He'd built the business from nothing, a single rented storefront, a hand-lettered sign, and a reputation that took him 20 years to earn and only a handful of bad decisions to lose. He used to tell her, when she was young enough to still ask him questions about everything, that most things people threw away weren't actually ruined. They'd just never had anyone patient enough to look closely. Vivienne had believed that her whole life, about furniture, about people, about marriages that had gone quiet in the middle years and needed only tending, not rescuing. Grayson Hartley had taken her name when they married. She'd always found that sweet, almost old-fashioned in reverse. He had never built anything of his own, a string of sales jobs, a restaurant venture that folded within a year, a real estate license he never once used. Vivienne loved him anyway. She loved the way he made her laugh at dinner parties, the way he remembered small details about people he'd only met once. Their daughter Josephine used to joke that her father could sell sand to a man drowning in the ocean. Josephine was 34 now, a forensic accountant who spent her days untangling fraud cases for corporations too embarrassed to make them public. She loved her father. She also, if she was honest with herself, had never fully trusted him. Not since she was 17 and caught him lying about where he'd been on a Tuesday afternoon, a lie so smooth and so unnecessary it had lodged itself in her memory like a splinter she could never quite work loose. When Grayson announced his diagnosis, Josephine flew home that same night. "We'll fight this," she told her mother, gripping her hand across the kitchen table. Whatever it takes turned out to be more literal than either of them understood. If you've ever watched a family hold itself together through what looked like devotion, only to learn later that devotion was the disguise, you already know how quietly these things start. One folder, one diagnosis, nobody thought to question. That's usually all it takes. The first request came 3 weeks after the diagnosis. Grayson had found a specialist, an oncologist in Switzerland running an experimental immunotherapy trial not yet approved in the States. $40,000 just to be considered for enrollment. Vivienne didn't hesitate. She transferred the money that same afternoon, sitting beside her husband as he wept with what she believed was relief and gratitude. "I don't want to leave you," he told her, and she believed every word, because why wouldn't she? He looked thinner already, she thought, though later she would understand that was simply grief doing its work, the mind painting symptoms onto a body that carried none. The second request came 6 weeks later. A deposit toward a specialized treatment facility, then travel costs for a companion physician, then an off-label medication, not covered by any insurance, shipped from a private compounding pharmacy that, as it would eventually turn out, existed nowhere but on a website Grayson had built himself, using a template he'd found online. By month 8, Vivienne had liquidated $400,000. When the investments alone could no longer cover what the clinic was asking, Grayson gently raised the subject of the Millbrook property, the small lake house Vivienne's father had left her along with the business. Nothing extravagant, but paid off, and worth enough to matter. She sold it within 3 weeks, telling herself it was just wood and land, not the kind of thing that mattered when a life was at stake. By month 14, it was over $1 million. She never once questioned the arithmetic, because grief has its own kind of math. When you believe you are watching the person you love disappear, you do not audit the invoices. You pay them, you pray, and then you pay them again. Grayson had a way of delivering each new number that made it feel less like a request and more like a shared act of hope. He would sit across from her at the same kitchen table, laptop open, showing her charts he said came from the clinic. Survival curves, response rates, numbers dressed up in the language of medicine, and Vivienne, who had spent her career learning to read the grain of old wood rather than spreadsheets, took his word for all of it. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband. He was dying. Those two facts, together, made every question feel like a betrayal she wasn't willing to commit. There were small kindnesses folded into the deception too, and those were, in some ways, the cruelest part. He remembered to bring her tea when she cried. He held her hand at the bank when the wire transfers grew large enough that even the teller began asking gentle questions. He let her believe, for 14 months, that she was the strongest person in the room, the wife who would do anything, who would sell anything, who would empty an entire retirement fund without a single complaint, because that was what love asked of her, and she had never once considered saying no to what love asked. Before we go further, has anyone in your own life ever asked you to trust them completely, and you did, simply because the alternative felt cruel? Keep that feeling in mind. It matters for what happens next. It was Josephine who first noticed the inconsistency, though it took her nearly a year to admit what she was actually seeing. She had flown to Switzerland herself, insisting on meeting the specialist, wanting to understand the protocol, to be present the way a daughter should be. Grayson discouraged the trip gently at first, then more firmly, citing hospital privacy policies and the fragile state of Dr. Ansgar Volker, the physician overseeing his case. "They don't allow family visits during induction," Grayson told her over the phone, his voice tired in a way that made her ashamed for pushing. "It's too disruptive to the other patients." Josephine let it go. She told herself she was being paranoid, that her professional instincts, trained to sniff out fabricated numbers and hollow shell companies, were bleeding into her personal life where they had no business being. Her father was sick. Sick men didn't need their daughters cross-examining them, but the forensic accountant in her kept a private file anyway, just notes, just in case. She noticed the clinic's name, when searched, returned almost nothing. A single web page with stock photography and a phone number that rang through to a generic voicemail box. She noticed every wire transfer her mother made went not to a Swiss banking institution, but to a private account routed through an intermediary company registered in Delaware. She noticed her father's medical trips never left him with jet lag, or a change in his sleeping patterns, or any of the small physical residue that international travel leaves on a person. She noticed, and she said nothing, because the alternative was unthinkable. There was a particular evening, about 10 months in, when Josephine almost said something. She and her father were alone in the kitchen, her mother upstairs, and she'd set her laptop down between them, with the clinic's website pulled up, the stock photography of smiling nurses, the phone number she'd already tried 3 times without an answer. "This doesn't look right to me," she said carefully, watching his face the way she watched a set of financial statements. For the tell, for the flicker. Grayson had looked at the screen for a long moment, then closed the laptop gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you didn't want someone walking into. "I know it looks strange," he told her. "European medical sites are different, less polished. You're used to corporate branding, sweetheart. This is a real clinic run by real doctors who care more about patients than marketing budgets." It was such a reasonable-sounding answer. That was the thing about her father she kept forgetting and relearning. He never lied loudly. He lied in the register of someone explaining something obvious to a person who simply hadn't thought it through. And Josephine, despite every professional instinct honed over a decade of catching people exactly like him, let the explanation sit there long enough to feel true. Around that same stretch of time, 2 hours outside the city, a woman named Odalis Reyes worked the front desk at a boutique hotel, the kind of place people went for anniversaries and for the kind of quiet arrangements neither party wanted photographed. She was 29, recently out of an engagement that had left her cautious, and it had been several months since a man had checked in alone for what he called a business trip to clear his head. He did not tell her he was married. He did not tell her he had a daughter. He told her he was a widower, that he'd lost his first love to illness years ago, and that he was only now, cautiously, letting himself feel something again. Odalise found that version of him tender, worth waiting for. She had no reason not to believe him. He spoke about their future the way men speak about things they've already decided are true. A vineyard in Oregon, maybe. A small inn they'd run together. She lent him money sometimes, too, small amounts, always promised back once his consulting contract came through. If this story is teaching you anything so far, it's this. The people closest to a lie are often the last to see it, not because they're careless, but because love makes you generous with your doubt. By then, Odalise had started imagining a life with him in real, practical terms. She'd looked at listings for small inns near the coast. She'd started a folder on her computer labeled simply Us, filled with paint swatches and floor plans neither of them had any real claim to yet. Grayson encouraged all of it, sitting beside her some evenings, scrolling through property listings, speaking about their future with the specific, grounded confidence of a man who never once had to account for where the money would actually come from. She didn't know his consulting contract didn't exist. She didn't know the small loan she'd given him, folded quietly into a man's pocket, who had access to nearly $2 million that wasn't his. She only knew that he made her feel chosen, in a way her broken engagement never had, and that feeling was worth more to her than any question she might have thought to ask. The truth began coming apart, though it started smaller than anyone expected, with a photograph. On a trip to a lake 2 hours north, Odalise tagged Grayson in a picture from the weekend. Golden light, the two of them on a dock, laughing, his arm around her waist. Both of them looked impossibly well. The post was public for exactly 40 minutes before she made her account private again. 40 minutes was long enough. A woman from Vivienne's old church congregation saw it, recognized Grayson instantly despite the sunglasses and, meaning no harm, thinking only that she was sharing good news, mentioned to Vivienne at a charity luncheon how wonderful it was that Grayson looked so well these days, considering everything. Vivienne smiled, thanked her, drove home with her hands shaking on the wheel the entire way. She didn't confront him immediately. That wasn't her nature. 40 years spent running a business built on patience, on the slow, careful restoration of things other people had already given up on. Told her that whatever this was needed to be fully understood before she said a single word. She called her daughter. "I need you to look into something," Vivienne said, and Josephine, hearing the particular flatness in her mother's voice, didn't ask a single question. She simply said, "Send me everything you have," and got to work. This is usually the moment where a family has to decide something hard. Do you confront what you suspect, or do you gather proof first, knowing the proof might be worse than the suspicion? Vivienne chose proof. It cost her 4 more days of not knowing. It also meant that when the truth finally arrived, nobody could argue with it. It took Josephine 4 days to build the full picture. 4 days of bank statements and wire transfer records and a private investigator she hired using her own savings because she couldn't bring herself to touch what little remained of her mother's money. What she found broke something in her that she suspected would never fully mend. There was no Dr. Ansgar Volker. There was no clinic. There was no immunotherapy trial, no compounding pharmacy, no medical condition of any kind. A fact confirmed within the hour by Grayson's own longtime physician, a man who had examined him 8 months earlier and pronounced him, in writing, in perfect health. There was, however, a woman named Odalise Reyes, a lake house rental in her name, a joint account Grayson had quietly opened with her 3 months prior, and a total of $1,860,000 that had moved out of Vivienne's retirement fund and, through a maze of transfers designed to look complicated enough to discourage anyone from following, into accounts that ultimately funded her husband's second, secret life. The private investigator she'd hired, a retired detective named Walter Byrne, who now mostly handled corporate background checks, had called her the night before with a tone she recognized from her own work, the careful neutrality people use right before they hand you something that's going to hurt. "I've traced the lake house lease," he told her. 6-month rental, renewed twice, paid in cash the first time, wire transfer the second, same routing pattern as the Delaware account. He paused. "I also found the woman's name on a joint account opened 90 days ago. I'd bring your mother in for this next part, if she's ready. Josephine wasn't sure her mother would ever be ready, and she wasn't sure she was either. She'd spent a decade sitting across from executives who'd embezzled from their own companies, watching them rationalize theft with the same practiced ease her father used to explain away a missed phone call. She had never once, in all those years, imagined she'd be running the same kind of investigation on her own family's finances, using her own mother as the unwitting victim in a case she couldn't walk away from because there was no client to hand it off to. Just her mother, just the truth, whatever shape it turned out to have. Josephine sat in her car outside her mother's house for 45 minutes before she could make herself go inside. If you've ever had to be the one who finds the truth and then has to decide how to hand it to someone you love, you already understand why that took her 45 minutes. Some truths need a moment before you're allowed to say them out loud. The confrontation happened on a Sunday, at the same kitchen table where the flowers had once scattered across the floor. Josephine insisted on being there. She'd also, without telling her mother, insisted on something else. She'd invited Odalys. It was a risk. It could have turned ugly, loud, useless. But something in Josephine's instincts, the same instincts that had spent a year quietly documenting inconsistencies, told her that the full truth would only land if every person carrying a piece of it sat in the same room at the same time. Odalys, she reasoned, was not the villain of this story. She was another woman who had been lied to, just with different stakes. She was right. When Odalys arrived and understood, really understood, watching Vivienne's face, watching the framed wedding photograph on the hallway wall, watching 35 years of marriage sitting in that woman's shoulders, something in her expression collapsed entirely. She hadn't known about the wife. She hadn't known the money's true source. She had believed, right up until that Sunday afternoon, that she was building a future with a grieving widower who loved her. He told me you'd passed away, Odalys said quietly to Vivienne. The two women, who by every measure should have hated each other, instead sat across the same table in a silence that carried more understanding than either expected. Grayson arrived 20 minutes later, having been told only that Vivienne needed to discuss the treatment schedule. He walked in already mid-sentence about a delayed shipment of medication and stopped completely when he saw who was sitting there. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Josephine watched her father's face move through an entire catalog of expressions, confusion, then calculation, then something that looked almost like relief, as if some exhausting performance had finally, mercifully, been allowed to end. "I can explain," he said, which was, Josephine would later reflect, the single most useless sentence a person could offer in that moment. He tried anyway. He talked about pressure, about feeling invisible in his own marriage for years, about a life he'd never gotten to have because he'd spent 3 decades being Vivienne Hartley's husband instead of anyone of his own making. He talked about Odalys like she'd rescued him from something, and Vivienne watched Odalys's face crumple with the realization that she had never been a rescue, only a hiding place. "You told everyone you were dying," Vivienne finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You let our daughter cry herself to sleep for a year. You let me sell the house in Millbrook to pay for a treatment that never existed, for a doctor who was never real, so you could build a life with someone else on the money my father spent his whole life earning." "Vivienne, don't." She held up a hand, and something in the steadiness of it made even Josephine go still. "You had months, Grayson. You had 100 small moments where you could have said, 'I made a mistake, I'm unhappy, I want something different.' I would have been devastated. I would have survived it. Instead, you decided I needed to bury you first. You made our daughter grieve a father who wasn't dying. You let me believe I was the bravest version of myself I had ever been, when really, I was just the easiest person in the world to lie to." Grayson opened his mouth again, and this time, nothing came out at all. Odalys, who had been silent for most of it, finally spoke, her voice thin. "You told me she'd remarried, that you two had been apart for years before she passed. You said her name was Marguerite." She looked at Vivienne with something like an apology forming behind her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I would never have. I didn't know any of this was real. Any of you were real." "I know," Vivienne said, and she meant it, because whatever else this day had cost her, it hadn't cost her the ability to tell the difference between a woman who had lied and a woman who had simply been lied to. "I restored things for a living, Grayson. I know exactly what it looks like when something is worth saving." She stood up. "This isn't that. If your family has ever had a moment like this one, the moment where someone finally says the sentence that ends the performance for good, you know it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like grief arriving twice. The legal reckoning that followed was, in its way, quieter than the emotional one. Fraud like this is difficult to prosecute cleanly when the victim is a spouse rather than a stranger. Marital finances occupy a murky legal space, but Josephine, using every professional skill she had, built a case airtight enough that Grayson's own attorney recommended settlement rather than trial. He signed over what remained of the diverted funds, forfeited claims to marital property he might otherwise have contested, and disappeared from the family's life with the particular quietness of a man who understands he has run out of stories left to tell. Odalys, to everyone's surprise, stayed in occasional contact with Vivienne, not close, not warm exactly, but honest in a way that felt earned. She eventually testified, when it mattered, corroborating a timeline that helped Josephine's case immeasurably. In an odd, unplanned way, the woman who had unknowingly helped wreck a marriage became one of the reasons the truth came out at all. There was a quieter revelation buried inside the larger one the family only pieced together weeks later. Grayson's forged medical documents had been produced with help from an old business contact, a man named Foster Renwick, who ran a small document forging operation out of a print shop 2 towns over. Tracing Renwick's other clients, investigators found that Grayson wasn't his only customer among people looking to fake illness, identity, or death for financial gain, a quiet, small-scale industry that had apparently been running for years. It made the betrayal feel less like a singular cruelty, and more like something Grayson had simply purchased off a shelf. One option among several, chosen because it was efficient. Vivienne found that fact, oddly, the hardest to sit with. Not that he'd lied, that the lie had been so easy to buy. Before we get to how this family rebuilt itself, ask yourself this. When someone finally shows you who they are you willing to believe them the first time? Vivienne wasn't, not at first. Almost none of us are. That's not weakness. That's just what love does to judgment. She did not rebuild the retirement fund. Not entirely. Not in the way she'd once planned. But she did something she hadn't expected to do at 62. She went back to work. Not teaching, not restoration exactly, but something adjacent. Consulting for the very company that had bought Hartley and Vale, advising them on authentication and provenance for high-value antique furniture, work she was uniquely suited for after a lifetime spent learning to tell what was real from what had been cleverly, expensively faked. There was a symmetry to it she didn't miss. Josephine moved back into her childhood bedroom for 6 months, ostensibly to help her mother through the legal proceedings, though both women understood it was really so neither of them would have to be alone with what they now knew. They grew closer in that stretch of time than they had been in years. 2 women who had both, in different ways, been trained by the same man to doubt their own instincts, now slowly relearning how to trust them again. Josephine also, somewhat to her own surprise, began seeing someone, a colleague named Corwin Ashfield, who'd helped her build the fraud case without charging her a cent, working long nights beside her over spreadsheets and bank records, watching her hold herself together through a betrayal that echoed, in smaller ways, wounds of his own. What started as something practical, almost incidental, grew into the kind of steadiness Josephine hadn't realized she'd been missing. A partner who understood, without needing it explained, why she now insisted on complete transparency in every joint decision they made, down to the smallest financial detail. Vivienne, for her part, took longer to trust anything resembling comfort again. She turned down 2 well-meaning setups from old friends who thought a woman her age shouldn't be alone. She wasn't interested in being rescued, and she said as much, more than once, to anyone who suggested otherwise. What she wanted instead was smaller, and in its way, harder to give herself permission for, an ordinary Tuesday that wasn't secretly funding someone else's future. A bank statement she didn't have to double-check. A husband's voice on the phone that didn't require, underneath every sentence, a small, quiet act of faith she no longer had left to spend. She found pieces of that in the work. Authenticating a 19th-century writing desk for a private collector, she'd run her fingers along a seam where someone, decades earlier, had tried to disguise a repair with matching stain instead of matching craftsmanship. It was a good enough fake to fool most buyers. It didn't fool her. She wrote her report, noted the discrepancy, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in over a year. The quiet satisfaction of being right about what was real, and being believed when she said so. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel isn't really about the money. It's about who earns the right to be trusted again. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Josephine and Corwin's relationship survives because of that honesty, or in spite of it? A year to the day after that Sunday at the kitchen table, the Sunday the truth finally sat down across from all of them, Vivienne stood in that same room, arranging a fresh bouquet of peonies, the same flowers that had spilled across the floor the morning this all began. Josephine walked in, holding a folder of her own. For one disorienting second, Vivienne's stomach dropped, the old fear returning, unbidden, at the sight of paper in a loved one's hands. But this folder held something else entirely. The finalized paperwork for a small restoration workshop the two of them were opening together, funded modestly but honestly, built from what remained rather than what had been taken. Hartley and daughter, the sign would read, not the empire her father had built. Something smaller, slower, entirely their own. We don't have to make it big, Josephine said, watching her mother's face. We just have to make it real. Vivienne set down the flowers and pulled her daughter into a hug that lasted longer than either of them planned. Some things, she understood now, could not be faked convincingly enough to survive being looked at closely. Love, it turned out, was one of them. So was grief. So, in the end, was family. Not the version built on secrets and performance, but the one that remained standing after every lie had finally, completely, burned away. If this story meant something to you, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories about what family really costs and what it's actually worth when it's earned instead of taken.
We don't have to make it big. We just have to make it real.